In 1993, Richard Wayne Hoagland vanished from Portage, Indiana. He was 43 years old, married with children, and by all appearances, living a normal suburban life. Then one day, he was gone. His family searched for him. Police investigated every lead. Years passed with no answers. Eventually, everyone assumed he was dead. His wife moved on. His children grew up without a father. 23 years later, he turned up alive in another state, living under a fake name. Yet when asked why he'd disappeared, his explanation was remarkably simple: family issues. The details of Richard Hoagland's disappearance are frustratingly sparse. Unlike high-profile cases that generate years of coverage, Hoagland's vanishing was quiet. A man went missing. Police looked into it. No body. No evidence of foul play. The case went cold. What we know is that in 1993, something happened that made Richard Hoagland decide that disappearing was preferable to staying. When whatever it was, marital problems, financial trouble, personal demons, he chose to walk away from everything and start over as someone else. He would maintain that lie for more than 2 decades. Creating a new identity in 1993 was easier than it is today. There was no social media to track someone's digital footprint. Driver's licenses didn't have biometric data or centralized databases. Background checks were less comprehensive. If you had cash, a plausible story, and the willingness to cut all ties with your past, you could become someone else. That's what Hoagland did. He adopted a completely new name and fabricated a new background. He moved to a different state. He built a completely separate life, with no connection to the family he'd left behind in Indiana. For 23 years, he lived as a ghost, a man whose real identity existed only in missing person databases and the memories of people who'd stopped expecting to see him again. Meanwhile, he and his family lived with the loss. His wife had to raise their children alone. She had to explain, somehow, why Daddy wasn't coming home, first as a mystery, then as a presumed tragedy. She had to rebuild her life around the hole her husband left. His children grew up without a father. They went through birthdays, graduations, first jobs, weddings, and every other milestone. All the moments a father is supposed to be there for, carrying the weight of his absence. Eventually, his wife had him declared legally dead. It was the only way to move forward, to handle practical matters, to close a chapter that had no ending. And then, 23 years later, the ending arrived. The circumstances of Hoagland's discovery aren't entirely clear. What we know is that in 2016, through a combination of investigative work and modern identification techniques, his true identity was finally uncovered. The man who'd been living quietly under an assumed name in another state, working, paying rent, existing as though his previous life had never happened, was Richard Wayne Hoagland, a missing person from Indiana who'd been presumed dead since the mid-1990s. When confronted by investigators, Hoagland didn't break down. He didn't offer elaborate explanations or emotional confessions about the family he'd abandoned. And he said he'd left because of family issues with his wife and children. That was his explanation. 23 years of absence, 23 years of his family's grief and confusion, reduced to 2 words: family issues. The aftermath was complicated by crime. Living under a false identity for 2 decades requires a certain amount of fraud. Hoagland had presumably obtained identification documents illegally. He'd worked, paid taxes, yet interacted with government systems, all under a name that wasn't his. He was arrested and charged with identity fraud and forgery. The man who'd vanished from Indiana to escape whatever problems weighed on him in 1993 discovered that his great escape had created an entirely new set of problems. Legal ones this time, with consequences he couldn't simply walk away from. But legal consequences for identity fraud are typically less severe than the emotional damage he'd caused. Well, a few months in jail doesn't begin to address 23 years of wondering, grieving, and moving on, only to learn the person you mourned was alive the whole time. What makes someone walk away from their entire life? Richard Hoagland cited family issues, which tells us nothing. But looking at similar cases, patterns emerge. Sometimes it's financial desperation, crushing debt, failed businesses, the feeling that bankruptcy would be worse than disappearing. Yes, sometimes it's escape from a bad marriage, though divorce is legal and much simpler than faking your death. Sometimes it's mental illness, depression so severe that the person believes everyone would be better off without them. And sometimes it's just selfishness, the desire to start over, to shed responsibilities, to become someone without baggage. Whatever drove Hoagland, the result was the same. A family devastated, a community deceived, and 2 decades of lies. The family's reaction hasn't been made public. This is probably appropriate. Whatever they felt when they learned Richard was alive, shock, anger, grief renewed, relief, disgust, belongs to them. They didn't ask for this story. They didn't choose to become part of a news cycle about a man who abandoned them. What we can imagine is the complexity of those feelings. Do you want to see someone who disappeared for 23 years? Do you want to hear their explanation? Does family issues mean anything when weighed against decades of absence? Some families in these situations reconcile. Some don't. Some try and fail. The relationships that existed in 1993 can't be rebuilt. Too much has changed. Too much time has passed. Whatever comes after can only be something new. Richard Hoagland's case raises uncomfortable questions. If you disappear voluntarily, is it a crime? Against whom? You're not hurting yourself. You're making a choice about your own life. But you're certainly hurting the people who love you, who search for you, who grieve you. There's no law against abandoning your family. There's no law against letting people think you're dead when you're not. The legal consequences Hoagland faced were for identity fraud, not for the emotional destruction he caused. Maybe that's as it should be. You can't legislate family relationships. You can't make it illegal to be a terrible husband and father. But it means people like Richard Hoagland face minimal accountability for maximum damage. A few months for fraud, and then what? A man in his 60s trying to figure out what comes next after 23 years of living a lie. Cases like Hoagland's are more common than people realize. According to various estimates, hundreds of people in America disappear voluntarily every year. Most are eventually found or return on their own. Some never do. The motivations vary. The methods vary. But the pattern is consistent. Someone decides their current life is unbearable, and rather than change it, they abandon it. They leave behind confused, devastated families and frustrated investigators who pour resources into solving what looks like a potential homicide. They leave behind children who grow up wondering what they did wrong, whether it was their fault. They leave behind spouses who spend years under a cloud of suspicion, in wondering if their neighbors and coworkers secretly think they're murderers, and if they're ever found, they offer explanations that explain nothing at all. Family issues. Richard Hoagland is not a sympathetic figure. Whatever problems he faced in 1993, there were solutions that didn't involve vanishing. Divorce exists, therapy exists, bankruptcy exists. Instead, he chose to let his wife and children believe he was dead. He chose to live under a fake name while they grieved him. He chose, every single day for more than 2 decades, not to pick up a phone and tell them he was alive. That's not running from problems. That's something else. The story of Richard Hoagland doesn't have a moral or a lesson. It's just a portrait of a man who decided to stop being himself and succeeded for 23 years at enormous cost to everyone who'd loved him. He erased Richard Hoagland from existence. He became someone else and committed to that fiction for 23 years. And when he was finally found, the person who emerged wasn't a returning father. He wasn't a prodigal husband seeking forgiveness. He was just a stranger who'd stolen 2 decades from his family and had nothing to say about why. Some disappearances are crimes, some are tragedies, and some are just acts of profound selfishness extended across decades, leaving damage that can never be fully repaired. Richard Hoagland disappeared because of family issues. His family has been dealing with the real issues ever since. On May 1st, 2013, a homeless woman walked into a police station in Key Largo, Florida. She was thin, weathered, clearly living rough for a long time. She had the hollow eyes to prove it. "I want to turn myself in," she said. "I'm a homeless woman." "I want to turn myself in," she said. "I'm a missing person." Officers ran her name, Brenda Heist, missing from Lititz, Pennsylvania, since February 2002, presumed dead. Her husband had been investigated for her murder. She wasn't kidnapped. She wasn't held captive. She'd walked away from her entire life, her children, her husband, everything, and lived as a homeless drifter for 11 years. Now she wanted to come back. February 8th, 2002. Lititz, Pennsylvania. Brenda Heist was 42 years old, going through a difficult divorce. Her marriage to Lee Heist was ending, and the final papers were supposed to be signed the next day. She had 2 children, a daughter, Morgan, who was 12, a son, Lee Jr., who was 8. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing to indicate what had happened. Brenda Heist had simply vanished. For 11 years, everyone assumed she was dead. Lee Heist was investigated as a murder suspect. Police searched the property. They dug up the yard. They questioned him repeatedly. Yet he maintained his innocence, but the suspicion never fully disappeared. "I was the last person to see her," he told reporters years later. "Of course they looked at me." The children grew up without their mother. Morgan was told she'd probably been killed. She learned to live with the ambiguity, the not knowing, the wondering, the grief for someone who might be dead and might not be. In 2010, Brenda Heist was declared legally dead. It seemed like the only possible explanation. Here's what actually happened. On the day she disappeared, Brenda Heist drove to that parking lot and sat in her car, crying. The stress of the divorce, the financial pressure, the feeling that her life was falling apart, it all hit her at once. A group of strangers approached her. Drifters, hitchhikers, people living outside the system. They asked if she was okay. They were heading to Florida. Did she want to come? She said yes. That's it. That's the whole decision. No elaborate plan, no long-term thinking. Just a desperate woman who saw an exit and took it. She left her purse, her car, her children, and her entire identity in that parking lot and walked away. For the next 11 years, Brenda Heist lived off the grid. She camped in the woods, slept under bridges, and stayed in overcrowded homeless shelters. She picked up odd jobs under fake names, cleaning houses, working at RV parks, whatever paid cash. She never called home. She never checked on her children. She never told anyone who she really was. Sometimes she thought about going back. "I wanted to go back 1,000 times, she later said. But the longer she stayed away, the more impossible returning became. How do you explain a year of silence to your children? 2 years? 5? A decade? Each passing month added another layer of guilt that made the prospect of walking back through that door feel more terrifying than staying homeless. So she didn't go back. She just kept drifting. A year after year. The question everyone asks, why? Brenda Heist has given explanations, but none of them feel adequate. She was depressed. She was overwhelmed. She'd been rejected from a housing program that morning and felt like everything was impossible. She'd been having suicidal thoughts, and walking away felt like an alternative to ending her life. These aren't reasons, they're descriptions of a mental state. Yet millions of people feel depressed and overwhelmed without abandoning their children. Brenda Heist did something extreme, something most people can't fathom, and no explanation has ever made it make sense. "I was a coward," she said. "I was selfish." That's probably the closest she's come to the truth. By 2013, life on the streets had worn Brenda down. She was in her 50s now. Her health was declining. She'd been homeless for more than a decade. And the fantasy of freedom had long since given way to the reality of exhaustion, illness, and isolation. She missed her children. She wanted to see her grandchildren she didn't know existed until later. She wanted to stop running. So she walked into that police station in Key Largo and gave her real name for the first time in 11 years. The reaction was not sympathetic. Her ex-husband, Lee, was furious. He'd spent years as the prime suspect in her presumed murder. He'd been investigated, questioned, looked at sideways by neighbors and strangers alike. He'd had to sit his children down and explain that Mommy was probably dead, that they might never know what happened to her. He'd had to rebuild his entire life from the ground up while the community whispered about what he might have done to his wife. "I divorced her when I thought she was dead," he told reporters. "I'm disgusted." The children's reaction was even more painful. Morgan, now 23, had spent more than half her life without her mother. Lee Jr. had no real memories of her at all. "She was dead to me already," Morgan said. What happens when a missing person returns and everyone wishes they hadn't? Brenda Heist discovered that walking away was easier than coming back. The family she'd abandoned had moved on. They'd grieved her. They'd built lives without her. And now here she was, expecting what? Forgiveness? A place in their lives? She didn't get it. Her children declined to see her. Her ex-husband wanted nothing to do with her. The community that had once searched for her, mourned her, treated her disappearance as a tragedy. They were angry. She'd made fools of everyone. There were no criminal charges. Abandoning your family isn't illegal, however devastating it might be. Brenda Heist was free to go, but she had nowhere to go to. The aftermath has been quiet. Brenda reportedly reconnected with some family members eventually. The details are private, as they should be. Whatever relationship she has or doesn't have with her children now is between them. But the damage is permanent. Morgan Heist grew up without a mother. She spent her teenage years believing she was an orphan of sorts, that something terrible had happened, and she'd never know what. Then she learned the truth. Nothing terrible happened. Her mother just left. That's almost worse than murder. At least murder isn't a choice. Brenda Heist's case isn't unique. Hundreds of people disappear voluntarily every year. They're overwhelmed by debt, or divorce, or mental illness, or the simple crushing weight of the lives they've built. They see an exit and take it, leaving everyone who loves them to wonder and grieve. Some eventually come back. Some don't. Some die on the streets, anonymous, their families never knowing what happened. What makes this case stand out is how long she stayed gone. 11 years missing. 11 years of investigation. 11 years of her children growing up motherless. And then, I want to turn myself in. I'm a missing person. There's no redemption arc here. Brenda Heist isn't a survivor of trauma. She isn't a victim of circumstance. She's a woman who, faced with difficulty, chose to abandon her children and let everyone who loved her believe she was dead. She's paid for that choice. She spent 11 years homeless, aging badly, living without connection or stability. She came back to find that the family she'd left had learned to live without her, and they didn't want her back. But her children paid more. They didn't choose any of this. They were 8 and 12 when their mother walked away, and they spent their formative years grieving someone who was alive and never called. Brenda Heist wanted to disappear, and she did. For 11 years, she was gone. What she discovered is that disappearing is the easy part. Yes, it's what you leave behind that haunts you, and what haunts the people who loved you. She can never get those 11 years back. Neither can her children. Some disappearances are crimes, some are tragedies, and some are just choices. Terrible, selfish choices that destroy families as thoroughly as any violence could. Brenda Heist made that choice. Now, everyone lives with it. In December 2025, a 46-year-old woman in Florida received a phone call that changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Investigators were calling about a missing child case from 1983. A little girl named Michelle Newton, taken from Louisville, Kentucky, during a custody dispute. They tracked down a lead after 4 decades. The woman listened. Then she asked the obvious question, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're Michelle Newton," they said. "You're the missing girl." She had no idea. The story begins in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1983. Caught in the middle of a bitter custody dispute between her parents. Her father had been granted custody by the courts. Her mother, Deborah Brown, was supposed to have only visitation rights. That arrangement wasn't acceptable to Deborah. Rather than follow the court order, she made a decision that would affect 3 lives for the next 4 decades. She took Michelle and vanished. The father reported the abduction immediately. Louisville police investigated. A felony warrant was issued for Deborah Brown for custodial interference. Michelle Newton was entered into the national database of missing and exploited children. But in 1983, finding someone who wanted to disappear was almost impossible. There was no internet, no social media, no facial recognition technology, no DNA databases. If you moved to a different state, changed your name, and kept a low profile, you could effectively cease to exist. That's exactly what Deborah Brown did. She created an entirely new life, new state, new identity, new story about who she was and where she came from. And she raised Michelle as if the life in Louisville had never happened. Michelle grew up believing every word her mother told her. She didn't know her father was searching for her. She didn't know there was an active felony warrant with her mother's name on it. She didn't know she was listed in missing children databases across the country. She had no memories of Louisville. She was 4 years old when she was taken, young enough that her earliest memories were of the new life, not the old one. Young enough that when her mother told her stories about where they came from, Michelle had no way to contradict them. As far as she knew, she was exactly who her mother said she was. 42 years is a long time. Michelle went to school under whatever name her mother gave her. She graduated. She grew up. She probably dated, maybe married, maybe had children of her own. She built an entire adult life on a foundation that was, unbeknownst to her, completely fabricated. Meanwhile, her father lived with the loss. How do you move on when your daughter disappears and no one can find her? When every lead goes nowhere? Yet when years turn into decades and the little girl you're searching for becomes a woman you wouldn't even recognize. Some parents in this situation never stop searching. Some eventually have to accept that the child is gone and try to build something resembling a normal life. We don't know much about Michelle's father, how he coped, whether he kept searching, what those 42 years were like for him. What we know is that in 2025, he was still alive, and he finally got an answer. The break came from a Crime Stoppers tip. Someone, somewhere, knew something. Maybe a relative who'd kept the secret for decades and finally couldn't carry it anymore. Maybe a friend who'd always suspected the stories didn't add up. Maybe someone who'd seen Michelle's case profiled and recognized a face. The specifics haven't been made public. What matters is that the tip was credible enough for investigators to act on it. They traced Deborah Brown to Florida. More importantly, yet they traced her daughter, now a 46-year-old woman living a quiet life, completely unaware that she was the subject of a 4-decade-old kidnapping case. Imagine that phone call. You're going about your normal day when investigators contact you. They start asking questions about your childhood, your mother, your birth name. You have no idea why. Then they tell you, you were kidnapped. Your real name isn't the name you've used your entire life. Your mother, the woman who raised you, he fed you, loved you in whatever way she was capable of loving, committed a felony when you were 4 years old. Your father, a man you don't remember, has been searching for you for 42 years. Everything you thought you knew about your origins is a lie. How do you process that? How do you reconcile the mother who raised you with the woman who stole you? How do you feel anything toward a father you have no memory of? Parental abduction cases are uniquely complicated. In stranger kidnappings, there's usually a clear villain. Someone evil took a child. The child is a victim. The kidnapper is a monster. The lines are clean. But when a parent takes a child, those lines blur. Deborah Brown isn't a stranger who grabbed Michelle off the street. She's her mother. She raised her for 42 years. She presumably loved her, provided for her, did all the things mothers do. And yet, she stole her. She deprived Michelle of her father, her extended family, her true identity. She built their entire relationship on a lie that lasted decades. Michelle is simultaneously a victim and someone who may have complicated feelings about being called one. Her mother is simultaneously a kidnapper and the woman who raised her. There's no simple narrative here, just messy, painful reality. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports that family abductions account for the largest category of missing children cases in the United States. So it happens far more than people realize. A custody dispute turns ugly. One parent disappears with the children, crosses state lines, changes names, and years pass before anyone finds them. These cases don't get the same attention as stranger abductions. There's an assumption that a child with a parent is safe, even when that parent has committed a crime, even when the other parent is devastated, even when the child is being raised on lies. Michelle Newton's case proves how much damage can be done without ever laying a hand on someone. Deborah Brown was arrested in December 2025 at her home in Florida. She was 70 years old, a grandmother, to all appearances, a normal woman living out her retirement. But she was now finally facing the felony custodial interference charge from 1983, a warrant that had sat active and unresolved for over 4 decades. Her attorneys will almost certainly argue that the passage of time should matter, that she raised Michelle well, that mother and daughter have a loving, functional relationship, that putting a 70-year-old woman through the criminal justice system after 42 years serves no meaningful purpose. But none of that changes what she did. She stole 42 years from a father. She stole her daughter's true identity. She built a life on deception and never told the truth. Even when Michelle was old enough to decide for herself what kind of relationship she wanted with both parents, the courts will decide what justice looks like. Michelle will decide what forgiveness looks like, if it's even possible. For Michelle, there are no good options. Embrace a father she doesn't remember? Reject a mother who raised her? Try to maintain relationships with both while processing that everything she believed about her childhood was false. She's 46 years old. Her personality, her identity, her sense of self, all of it was formed in the life her mother created. You can't undo that. You can only decide what to do with the truth. This story doesn't have a happy ending. Not yet, anyway. Deborah Brown awaits trial. A father who spent 42 years searching has finally found the daughter he lost. But she's a grown woman, a stranger, with no memory of him at all. Michelle Newton spent 42 years not knowing she was missing. She grew up, he's built a life, had relationships, made decisions, all under a false identity she didn't even know was false. Now she knows. The woman who raised her is a kidnapper. The man searching for her is her father. The life she lived, every birthday, every milestone, every memory, was built on a lie that started before she was old enough to remember the truth. What happens next is up to her. And that might be the cruelest part of all. On March 2nd, 1980, a 14-year-old boy walked into a police station in Ukiah, California, carrying a 5-year-old child. "I know my first name is Stephen," he told officers. He couldn't remember his last name, couldn't remember his parents' names. He'd been gone for 7 years, kidnapped at age 7, held by a pedophile, and only now escaping because his captor had taken another boy. Stephen Stainer didn't run to save himself. He ran to save someone else. December 4th, 1972. Stephen said he needed to ask his mom. The man told him they'd stop by his house first. They didn't. Kenneth Parnell drove Stephen to a remote cabin in Cathy's Valley, 40 miles away. By the time Stephen realized what was happening, his old life was already gone. Kenneth Parnell was a 40-year-old predator with a calculated and deeply disturbing plan. He was a convicted kidnapper who'd served time in the 1950s for abducting a boy in Bakersfield. He should never have been near another kid. But the system failed, as systems do, and Parnell was living free when he spotted Stephen. Parnell didn't just want to abuse Stephen. He wanted to own him. He told Stephen his parents didn't want him anymore, that they'd sold him. That his real name was now Dennis Parnell, and Kenneth was his father. He moved Stephen around constantly, different towns, different schools, different stories, to keep anyone from getting too close. And yes, he abused Stephen sexually, for years. This is the part that's hard to understand. Stephen stayed. He had opportunities to run. Parnell enrolled him in school under a fake name. Stephen interacted with teachers, classmates, other adults. He wasn't chained in a basement. He had freedom of movement. But he was 7 years old when it started. Then 8. Then 9. By the time he was old enough to understand what was happening, Parnell's brainwashing had taken root. Stephen believed his parents had abandoned him. He believed this twisted life was all he had. It's called grooming. It's what predators do to keep their victims compliant, and it worked on Stephen Stainer for 7 years. The turning point came in February 1980. Stephen was now 14. For Parnell, that was becoming a problem. Stephen was aging out of his preference. He was becoming harder to control, so Parnell did what he'd done before. He kidnapped another child. 5-year-old Timmy White was taken from his front yard in Ukiah. Parnell brought him back to the trailer where he was living with Stephen, intending to start the whole process over again with a new victim. But this time, there was something Parnell hadn't counted on: Stephen's conscience. For 7 years, Stephen had been Parnell's only victim. He'd been isolated, manipulated, abused, but he'd survived by compartmentalizing, by adapting, by accepting the unacceptable. Watching Parnell prepare to do the same thing to a 5-year-old changed something. Stephen looked at Timmy White and saw himself, the scared little boy who'd been taken at 7, who'd believed the lies, who'd lost everything. He couldn't save his own childhood, but maybe he could save this one. 2 weeks after Timmy was kidnapped, Stephen grabbed him and ran. They hitchhiked through the dark to Ukiah, traveling miles in the cold night air. Stephen knew vaguely where the police station was. He walked in, holding Timmy's hand, and said the words that would become the title of a TV movie. "I know my first name is Stephen." Officers were confused at first. A teenager with a small child claiming to have been kidnapped years ago? But they ran the names, and everything Stephen said checked out. Stephen Stainer. Missing since December 1972. His parents, Delbert and Kay Stainer, had never stopped looking. Timmy White's family was notified within hours. He'd been missing for 2 weeks. Thanks to Stephen, he was coming home. Kenneth Parnell was arrested the next day at a nearby motel, still with some of Timmy White's belongings. He received a sentence of 7 years for the kidnapping of Stephen Stainer. That's not a typo. 7 years for holding a child captive for 7 years. He served 5 of those. For the kidnapping of Timmy White, he received consecutive time. But the total sentence was shockingly light, given what he'd done. Parnell would later be arrested again in 2004 for attempting to buy a child. He died in prison in 2008. Some monsters never stop being monsters. Stephen's homecoming should have been a happy ending. It wasn't. He returned to a family he barely remembered. His parents were overjoyed, but didn't know how to relate to the traumatized teenager who'd replaced their 7-year-old. His siblings had grown up without him. The family dynamics had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. Stephen struggled badly in school, falling behind in most subjects. He struggled with authority figures who tried to set boundaries. He struggled to talk about what had happened to him, even as everyone, reporters, therapists, curious strangers, wanted him to relive it endlessly. "I returned almost a young stranger," he later said in a television interview. "Every time I turned around, someone was asking me questions about those 7 years." In 1989, NBC made a TV movie about Stephen's story. "I Know My First Name is Stephen" was a ratings hit. It brought national attention to child abduction and helped change how America thought about missing kids. Stephen served as a consultant on the project. He hoped it would help other victims, raise awareness, maybe prevent what happened to him from happening to someone else. But the attention was overwhelming. Stephen had never fully processed his own trauma, and now it was being dramatized for millions of viewers. On September 16th, 1989, just months after the movie aired, Stephen Stainer died. He was 24 years old. He was riding his motorcycle home from work on a quiet road when a car made an illegal turn and struck him, and he died at the scene. It was random, a traffic accident. Nothing to do with his past, but the cruelty of it was staggering. Stephen Stainer survived 7 years of captivity, saved a 5-year-old boy, escaped a pedophile, and tried to rebuild his life, only to die in a senseless accident at 24. He never got the chance to fully heal. He never got to see his story change laws and policies. He never got to grow old. The Stainer story has one more terrible chapter. Stephen had a younger brother, Carrie, who was 11 years old when Stephen was kidnapped. Carrie grew up in the shadow of his brother's disappearance, then in the shadow of his brother's traumatic return, then in the shadow of his brother's death. In 1999, Carrie Stainer was arrested for murder. He'd killed 4 women near Yosemite National Park. He became known as the Yosemite Killer. During his trial, Carrie claimed that Stephen's kidnapping had damaged him, that watching his family fall apart, that being ignored while everyone focused on his missing brother had warped something inside him. Whether that's true or just an excuse is impossible to know. What's certain is that the Stainer family suffered tragedy upon tragedy. A kidnapping, a difficult homecoming, a random death, and a son revealed as a serial killer. Stephen Stainer isn't remembered as a victim. He's remembered as a hero. He could have kept his head down, let Parnell do whatever he wanted to Timmy White, who survived a few more years until he aged out and was released. Nobody would have blamed him. Instead, he risked everything to save a 5-year-old boy he'd only known for 2 weeks. Timmy White grew up because of that decision. He became a sheriff's deputy. He named his daughter Stephen in honor of the boy who saved him. When Stephen died, Timmy was devastated. "He gave me my life back," Timmy said. "He was my hero." Stephen Stainer was 7 when he was taken and 14 when he escaped. He lived another 9 years. Not enough to process what happened? not enough to build the life he deserved. But in those 9 years, he did something most people never do. He saved someone. That's how he should be remembered. Not as a victim, not as a footnote to his brother's crimes, as the boy who, after 7 years of abuse and manipulation, still had enough humanity left to protect a stranger. On August 26, 2009, a woman walked into a California police station with 2 teenage girls. She gave her name as Alyssa. When officers asked the girls who they were, they couldn't answer. They'd never been to school. They'd never seen a doctor. They didn't know their own birthdays. Then the woman broke down. She wasn't Alyssa. Her name was J.C. Lee Dugard, and she'd been missing for 18 years. June 10th, 1991, South Lake Tahoe, California. 11-year-old J.C. was walking to her school bus stop, just a few hundred feet from her home. Her stepfather, Carl, watched from the garage as a gray sedan pulled up beside her. A woman leaned out. Then a stun gun crackled. Carl saw J.C. collapse. He jumped on his mountain bike and chased the car, but it disappeared into the neighborhood. By the time police arrived, his stepdaughter was gone. The search was massive. Flyers went up across California and Nevada. The case made national news, and everyone assumed the worst. That J.C. had been killed within hours of her abduction, like so many other missing children. Her family refused to give up hope. But as months turned to years, even hope began to fade. J.C. wasn't dead. She was alive, less than 200 miles away, in a suburban backyard in Antioch, California. Her kidnapper was Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender who'd served time for a previous kidnapping and rape. His wife Nancy had helped him take J.C. Together, they'd built a compound in their backyard, a hidden maze of tents, sheds, and makeshift structures concealed behind a 6-foot fence. This would be J.C.'s world for the next 18 years. The compound was a nightmare of isolation. J.C. lived in a series of tents and sheds hidden from the main house. She had no contact with the outside world, no school, no doctors, no friends, just Philip, Nancy, and eventually 2 daughters. Yes, J.C. gave birth twice while in captivity. Her first daughter was born when J.C. was just 14 years old. The second came a few years later. Both girls were fathered by Philip Garrido. The children grew up knowing nothing else. They'd never been to school. They'd never been to a doctor. They didn't even know their own last name. To them, Philip was dad, and J.C. was their older sister, not their mother. Here's what makes this case almost unbearable. People visited that property constantly. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender on parole. That meant regular visits from parole officers. Over the 18 years J.C. was held captive, officers came to that house at least 60 times. 60 times. They never found her. They never found the children. They never even looked in the backyard. In 2006, a neighbor called police to report that children were living in tents behind Garrido's house. A deputy came out, spoke to Garrido at the front door, and left. And he never entered the property. He never checked the backyard. The system designed to monitor sex offenders had completely failed. The break came from an unexpected place, UC Berkeley. In August 2009, Philip Garrido showed up at the university with his 2 daughters. He wanted permission to hold a religious event on campus. Something about him felt wrong to campus police officer Allie Jacobs. She ran his name. Sex offender, on parole, for the next day. When Garrido arrived at the parole office, he brought the girls again, and this time, a woman he introduced as Alyssa. The parole officer separated them for questioning. Within hours, the truth came out. J.C.'s first words to investigators have been reported different ways, but the moment she revealed her real name, the room went silent. J.C. Lee Dugard, missing since 1991, presumed dead for 18 years. She was alive. She was 29 years old, and she had 2 daughters that the world didn't know existed. The reunion with her mother was captured on video, though those images have been kept private. Terry Probyn had never stopped searching for her daughter. She'd kept JC's room exactly as it was. She'd never moved away from the area, hoping JC might somehow find her way back. Now, 18 years later, she had. But the JC who returned wasn't the 11-year-old who'd been taken. She was a woman who'd spent her entire adolescence and young adulthood in a backyard prison, who'd been raped repeatedly, who'd given birth twice without medical care, who'd raised 2 children in conditions most people can't imagine. The psychological complexity was staggering. Here's something that surprises people. JC had sought opportunities to escape, or at least what looked like opportunities. After several years, Philip began taking her out in public. She worked in his home printing business, interacting with customers. She had a phone. She had internet access. She was no longer physically restrained, but she didn't run. This is the part that's hard for outsiders to understand. JC had been taken at 11. She'd been isolated, manipulated, and conditioned for years. Her captors had become her entire world. Her children were there. Where would she go? Who would believe her? It's called coercive control. It's why victims of long-term captivity don't always flee when the cage door opens. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested immediately. The case made national and international headlines. A girl who'd been missing for 18 years, found alive with 2 children, living in a backyard compound that nobody, not parole officers, not neighbors, not law enforcement, had ever bothered to properly investigate. Philip received 431 years to life. Nancy received 36 years to life. Neither will ever see the outside of a prison, but for JC and her daughters, the sentence was just a formality. The harder work was just beginning. They had to learn how to live in the world. The girls had never been to school, never seen a doctor, never experienced anything resembling normal life. JC had missed everything. Her teens, her 20s, every milestone that defines growing up. She received $20 million from the state of California as settlement for the catastrophic failures that kept her captive for nearly 2 decades. The parole system that should have found her years earlier. The deputy who visited the Garrido property and never once checked behind the fence. The 60 parole visits over the course of Philip's supervision that accomplished absolutely nothing, while a kidnapped girl and her 2 children lived in filth just yards away. In 2011, JC published a memoir called A Stolen Life. It's unflinching in its honesty. The abuse, the isolation, the complicated feelings she developed toward her captors over nearly 2 decades. She's become an advocate for missing children and victims of kidnapping. Her foundation, the JAYC Foundation, focuses on helping families of missing persons and supporting those who've survived abduction. Her daughters, now adults, have largely stayed out of the public eye. They're building lives of their own, trying to define themselves by something other than the circumstances of their birth. The J.C. Dugard case changed how California handles sex offenders. New laws required GPS monitoring. Stricter protocols were put in place for parole visits. The failures that allowed her to remain hidden for 18 years were examined and, hopefully, corrected. But you can't legislate away every failure. Someone still has to check the backyard. One campus police officer who noticed 2 girls who seemed off. One decision to run a name and make a call. That's what finally brought JC home. JC Lee Dugard was 11 years old when she was taken. She was 29 when she was found. 18 years, her entire adolescence, her entire young adulthood, spent in a backyard compound. Hidden in plain sight, she survived. Her daughters survived. And against all odds, they've built real lives in the real world. But 18 years can't be given back. 60 parole visits can't be undone. The failure of every system that should have protected her is now part of the permanent record. JC's story isn't just about survival. It's about how someone can disappear in a suburban neighborhood a few hours from where they were taken and remain invisible for nearly 2 decades. It's about the girl in the backyard that no one ever found until she finally found herself. May 6th, 2013, Cleveland, Ohio. A man named Charles Ramsey was eating McDonald's when he heard screaming. A woman was trying to break through a door across the street, her arm reaching through a gap at the bottom. Ramsey ran over and kicked the door until it gave. The woman burst out with a small child, hysterical, barely coherent. "I'm Amanda Berry," she said. "I've been kidnapped. I've been missing for 10 years. There wasn't one disappearance on Seymour Avenue. There were 3. Michelle Knight vanished first. August 23rd, 2002. She was 21 years old, walking to a cousin's house when a man in a van offered her a ride. She never arrived. Amanda Berry disappeared next, April 21st, 2003. She was 16, walking home from her job at Burger King. It was the day before her 17th birthday. Gina de Jesus was last, April 2nd, 2004. 14 years old, walking home from school. She vanished in broad daylight. 3 women, 3 disappearances, all from the same neighborhood in Cleveland. And for nearly a decade, nobody connected them. The man who took them was Ariel Castro. He was 52 years old when it ended. A school bus driver, a musician who played bass in local salsa bands, a seemingly normal man in a seemingly normal house on a street full of seemingly normal houses. Inside, he'd created a prison. Castro kept the women chained in the basement and in upstairs bedrooms. He boarded up windows, yet he installed locks that could only be opened from the outside. He controlled everything: when they ate, when they showered, when they saw daylight. And he raped them, repeatedly, for years. Michelle was held the longest. She was also treated the worst. Castro beat her. He starved her. When she became pregnant, at least 5 times, he starved her and punched her stomach until she miscarried. Yet he later told investigators he considered Michelle disposable. She spent nearly 11 years in that house. By the time she escaped, she'd lost part of her hearing from the beatings. Her face had been so badly damaged that she needed reconstructive surgery. But Michelle Knight never broke. Even in the worst conditions, she survived. Amanda's captivity took a different turn. In 2006, she gave birth. The baby, a girl named Jocelyn, was delivered in a plastic kiddie pool in the house. Michelle Knight served as midwife. There was no doctor, no hospital, nothing sterile about it. Jocelyn became Castro's leverage. He told Amanda that if she tried to escape or signal for help, he'd kill the baby. For years, that threat kept her compliant. The child grew up in that house, never knowing the outside world. She was 6 years old when they finally escaped. Gina was the youngest when she was taken, 14 years old. Her father, Felix de Jesus, never stopped looking. So he handed out flyers, he organized searches, he appeared on television, on radio, anywhere that would have him. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, he led a vigil in the neighborhood. That neighborhood included Seymour Avenue. The de Jesus family walked past Castro's house during their searches. They handed him flyers. He took them. He smiled. Their daughter was inside the whole time. How does a house hide 3 kidnapped women for nearly a decade? The answer is terrifying. It wasn't that hard. Castro was careful. He kept the women separated at first. He controlled their access to windows and sound. He played music loudly to mask any noise. When visitors came, And they did come. He met them at the door and never let them inside. His own family visited. His children came over. They never went beyond the first floor. They never suspected anything. "I thought my dad was weird about the house," his daughter later said. "I didn't think he was a monster." The cracks appeared slowly. In 2004, police received a complaint that Castro had left a child alone on his school bus. They investigated him as an employee, but never as a suspect in the kidnappings. Neighbors occasionally reported strange things. A woman in the backyard, faces in the windows. Police came to the house at least twice. They knocked. No one answered. They left. It wasn't until Amanda Berry broke through that door that anyone realized what had been happening on Seymour Avenue for nearly 11 years. The escape itself was almost accidental. On May 6, 2013, Castro left the house but forgot to fully lock one of the doors. Amanda noticed. She'd been waiting. For years, she'd been waiting. For a moment like this, she went to the front door and started screaming. Her arm fit through a gap at the bottom. That's when Charles Ramsey heard her. Yes, the rest happened fast. Ramsey helped break down the door. Amanda called 911. That call has become famous, her voice shaking as she identified herself. Police arrived within minutes. They found Gina De Jesus and Michelle Knight inside. Both were in shock. Both were alive. Ariel Castro was arrested that night. The trial was short because Castro pleaded guilty to 937 charges, including multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and an aggravated murder for the pregnancies he terminated through starvation and physical assault. He received life plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, he gave a rambling, delusional statement that included the phrase, "I'm not a monster, I'm a sick individual." He blamed the women. He blamed pornography. He took responsibility for nothing. 1 month later, Ariel Castro hanged himself in his prison cell with a bedsheet. You see, he'd been in custody for 33 days. Some people call it justice. Others call it the ultimate escape. One last act of control by a man who spent a decade controlling every aspect of 3 women's lives. Either way, Castro never had to spend more than a few weeks actually facing what he'd done. The aftermath was complicated for all 3 women. Michelle Knight, who later changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, has been the most public. She wrote a memoir, spoke openly about the abuse, and has become an advocate for survivors. She's also distanced herself from the other 2 women, saying their experiences inside the house were very different. Amanda Berry has stayed more private. She co-authored a book with Gina De Jesus, but rarely gives interviews. Her daughter Jocelyn, born in captivity, has been shielded from the spotlight. Gina De Jesus has worked with her family's foundation to help other missing persons cases and advocate for abduction survivors. Her father Felix, who spent 9 years walking that Cleveland neighborhood with flyers, who passed by Ariel Castro's house countless times, who shook the hand of the man holding his daughter captive, he finally got to bring his daughter home. The moment he saw her alive was captured by news cameras, and it remains one of the most emotionally devastating pieces of footage from the entire case. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished in August 2013. The city tore it down as hundreds of people watched. But you can't demolish the memory. You can't tear down what 3 women experienced for nearly a decade. That stays. Cleveland calls this the miracle on Seymour Avenue. 3 women, given up for dead, found alive. A child born in captivity, now growing up in the real world. A monster who thought he'd gotten away with it, exposed by one unlocked door. But miracles shouldn't depend on a kidnapper's mistake. They shouldn't require a decade of captivity before someone notices. They shouldn't come down to whether a neighbor happens to hear a scream. Michelle Knight spent 11 years in that house. Amanda Berry spent 10. Gina De Jesus spent 9. 3 women, held for a combined 30 years, in a normal-looking house in a normal neighborhood, Nobody found them. They found themselves. The Cleveland Three didn't just survive, they escaped. They testified. They rebuilt their lives in ways that seemed impossible on May 5th, 2013. But their story isn't just about resilience. It's about how someone can disappear in an American city and remain hidden for a decade. How a monster can hide in plain sight, drive a school bus, play in a band, and wave to neighbors while 3 women are chained inside his house. The door that Amanda Berry broke through was always there. What was missing was someone willing to open it.